Cassandra Whitley had not planned for her life to shift so dramatically. But after years of working in the rigid environment of corporate data analysis, she found herself longing for something that demanded more than staring at endless streams of numbers on a screen. When she signed the lease for a parcel of land on the edge of a mid-sized town in Oregon, most of her colleagues thought she had gone slightly insane, trading the comfort of climate-controlled offices and predictable paychecks for mud, rusted hinges, and the hum of old machinery. Yet, for Cassandra, there was a pull that felt more visceral than rational. The weathered barn that stood in the center of the property reminded her of the few happy summers she had spent as a child visiting relatives in rural Kentucky, where the smell of hay and oil mixed into a scent that meant safety, curiosity, and the possibility of building something that mattered. She decided not to raise animals or convert the space into yet another rustic Airbnb like so many newcomers in the area, but instead to follow the thread of her own expertise. The barn would become a modest laboratory, a workshop where she could test new biodegradable composites that might reduce the overwhelming amount of plastic waste she had studied in her years behind a desk. The building itself had a skeletal charm, its high beams blackened by decades of weather, its floorboards uneven and scarred by the weight of tractors long gone. Cassandra spent her first weeks sealing cracks against the wind, installing ventilation systems scavenged from local auctions, and hauling in used industrial tables that bore the faint chemical ghosts of their former lives. It was not glamorous, not the sort of story her friends could post with envy on social media, but it was real in a way that life had not felt real for years. At night, she worked late, running quiet tests with cultures sealed in glass jars, listening to the gentle whir of fans and the rhythmic pulse of filtration pumps. The sound was hardly more than a steady breathing, easily drowned out by the wind in the trees or the occasional passing car on the distant highway. To Cassandra, it was almost comforting, proof that something was alive in the barn, even if it was only bacteria slowly chewing through polymers. She sometimes left the small window of the loft open just to hear the low vibration carry across the yard while she sat on the porch, drinking bitter coffee and sketching notes by hand. Her neighbors were polite in the beginning, nodding when they passed her driveway or slowing their cars just enough to glance at the changes taking place on the property. Most of the houses in the vicinity were ordinary suburban boxes planted in neat rows, their residents living lives ordered by shift work, school runs, and the occasional neighborhood barbecue. Cassandra's barn was the odd landmark, standing apart with its weathered roof and the faint glow that sometimes seeped through its cracks at midnight. For a while, no one said anything directly, though she noticed curiosity hardening into suspicion in the way certain curtains shifted when she walked by. Among them was Lucas Dane, who lived 2 lots down in a house that looked as though it had been frozen in time from the 1970s, with heavy brown curtains and a garden perpetually overgrown as if to shield it from prying eyes. Lucas was a man who blended easily into silence. He attended no gatherings, gave no greetings, and seemed to prefer that his house remain a blank square on the map of the street. Cassandra did not mind this. She herself was not one for forced small talk, and she respected the unspoken boundaries that came with living in a neighborhood. It was late autumn when he first approached her. She was stacking empty boxes outside the barn, her gloves smudged with graphite, when she heard the deliberate crunch of shoes on gravel. Turning, she saw him standing with his hands in the pockets of a faded jacket, his expression unreadable but not unfriendly. He spoke in a measured tone, commenting on the sound he had heard at night, asking if she was aware how easily it carried in the stillness. Cassandra explained carefully that the equipment was quiet and within legal limits, even offering to show him the sound monitor she had installed precisely to ensure compliance with county ordinances. Lucas nodded, listening without interrupting, and for a moment she thought the conversation would end there. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and said something that unsettled her more than an outright complaint might have. The thing about silence is that it tells more truths than words ever do. Some people can't stand what it reveals. Then he gave a thin smile, turned, and walked back toward his curtained house, leaving Cassandra with the uneasy sense that the air around her barn had just shifted in a way she could not name. The first official sign that something was seriously wrong arrived not in the form of a neighborly warning or a knock on her door, but as a thick envelope bearing the sterile weight of legal formatting. Cassandra found it wedged among grocery flyers and utility bills in her mailbox one gray morning, the paper heavy with a kind of authority that made her hands hesitate before opening it. Inside were several neatly bound pages written in the cold, clipped language of a civil complaint. Her name appeared in bold at the top, Defendant, followed by a series of accusations drafted with the meticulousness of someone who had thought carefully about every word. The plaintiff was Lucas Dane. He was suing her for noise violations, alleging that her barn emitted continuous mechanical disturbance that not only prevented him from sleeping, but caused him measurable stress, anxiety, and what his lawyer described as the beginnings of a severe auditory condition. The claim demanded that Cassandra cease all activity after 7 p.m. each evening and compensate him for damages totaling $50,000. Cassandra stood in her kitchen reading the complaint again and again, her eyes catching on the phrases that seemed to bleed disdain into her very existence. Reckless operation, negligent disregard for community well-being, willful disturbance of peace. The words were crafted not just to accuse but to brand her as a selfish intruder into the fragile order of suburban quiet. What unsettled her more than the accusations themselves was the precision with which times and dates were listed. Long tables of supposed incidents marked with exact hours, sometimes down to the minute, where Lucas claimed to have documented disruptive sound levels. He even included a rudimentary graph that illustrated spikes at irregular intervals, presenting what looked like scientific evidence. Yet Cassandra knew those times did not match her work schedule. More than once the report accused her of running equipment in the middle of the night while she had in fact been sleeping, the barn locked and dark. She tried to laugh at the absurdity, telling herself it was simply a mistake, perhaps an overreaction by a man unused to the presence of a neighbor with a project that strayed from the usual rhythms of barbecues and lawnmowers. But the seal of the county court at the bottom of the page was not a mistake. It meant that she was already inside the machinery of law, where each step required money, time, and a defense she was not prepared to mount. Her first instinct was to walk down the street and knock on Lucas's door, to ask why he had not come to her directly if there was truly a problem. But the memory of his earlier remark about silence whispering truths made her hesitate. He had chosen the courtroom over conversation, and that choice told her everything she needed to know about his intentions. When she informed her employer, the reaction was not sympathetic, but cautious. The company where she worked had invested resources into promoting sustainable practices, but their reputation depended on appearing beyond reproach. A lawsuit, even one that might later be dismissed, was considered a risk. Her supervisor explained it in a voice full of forced neutrality, saying that while they valued her initiative and believed in her talent, they had no choice but to temporarily remove her from all field demonstrations and limit her to remote analysis. Until the matter was clarified, Cassandra left the office with the complaint tucked back into her bag, feeling the strange humiliation of being treated not as a victim of a false claim, but as a liability. She contacted an attorney recommended by a colleague, a young woman named Marissa Cho, whose voice carried the deliberate calm of someone trained to handle outrage. Cassandra handed over the complaint and explained her project, her equipment, the sound monitors she had installed. Marissa listened carefully, then leaned back and said that while the evidence seemed favorable, the challenge lay not in truth, but in process. Civil courts thrived on delay, on the burden of proof falling heavily on the accused, and Lucas's lawyer had already managed to package his grievances into a narrative of harm. The problem, Marissa explained, is that he's not just saying you're noisy. He's saying you're negligent. That word matters. It suggests disregard, and judges pay attention to that. She recommended they gather all possible documentation, including Cassandra's utility records, her own logs of work hours, and, if possible, testimony from nearby neighbors. The first hearing was scheduled for a brisk Tuesday morning, and Cassandra found herself seated in the hushed, echoing space of the county courtroom, the smell of old wood and dust thick in the air. Lucas sat at the opposite table, dressed neatly in a suit that seemed slightly too large for his thin frame, his expression mild but focused. When asked to present his initial evidence, his lawyer produced printouts of the same charts Cassandra had already seen in the complaint. The judge flipped through them, tapping a pen against the table, and asked for clarification on how the data had been collected. Lucas's lawyer replied that his client had installed sensitive audio monitoring equipment in his home, capturing disturbances over several weeks. The graphs, he claimed, demonstrated consistent patterns of intrusive sound originating from the direction of the defendant's property. It might have been convincing, had the judge not paused at one of the tables, frowning. The highlighted spikes appeared between 2 and 3 in the morning on 3 separate occasions. Cassandra, clutching her folder of evidence, immediately recognized those nights. They were dates when she had been away entirely, visiting her sister in Portland, her barn dark and locked. When the judge raised an eyebrow, Lucas leaned forward and muttered something to his lawyer, who quickly amended the explanation, saying perhaps the equipment had captured delayed echoes or residual vibrations. The words sounded flimsy even as they were spoken, but the judge did not dismiss them outright. Instead, he noted the discrepancy and said the matter required further review. For Cassandra, the moment was both terrifying and strangely clarifying. Someone was manufacturing noise where none existed, manipulating data to paint her as a culprit. It was not enough for Lucas simply to dislike her barn or complain about inconvenience. He had constructed an elaborate case, one that required effort and planning. She left the courthouse with Marissa at her side, the morning sun glaring against the glass facade of the building, and felt the first real pulse of fear. Lucas Dane was not just a recluse with thin patience for change. He was someone willing to fabricate reality to achieve an end she could not yet see, and by dragging her into court he had set the stage for a conflict that would no longer remain hidden behind closed curtains. The days following the first hearing settled over Cassandra with the suffocating weight of uncertainty, the kind of tension that did not explode but instead coiled tightly around her routine until even the simplest tasks felt compromised. She tried to continue her work in the barn, adjusting the timers on her equipment, checking the data logs, keeping every detail in meticulous order in case she was asked to present them again. Yet beneath her discipline grew the gnawing suspicion that none of it mattered, that Lucas had already created a parallel narrative of her life, one where she was careless and disruptive, and that narrative was becoming more real in the eyes of the court than her own quiet reality. What unsettled her most was the feeling that he was not improvising. He seemed to be operating according to some plan that had started long before she became aware of it. One night, as she stood on the porch with her notebook open on her knees, she noticed a flicker in the distance. It was not the faint glow of a passing car or the shimmer of a porch light, but the unmistakable pulse of her barn's ventilation unit clicking on, even though she had shut the power off at the breaker earlier that evening. The low hum rolled across the yard, familiar yet wrong in its timing, and as she stared at the dark outline of the barn, her first instinct was not fear but confusion. How could machinery she had personally shut down be running? She pulled on her boots and crossed the gravel, her breath clouding in the air, and opened the heavy doors. Inside, the equipment was still, every switch in the off position, yet the sound she had heard was not her imagination. It was as if the barn itself had become an instrument for someone else's performance, vibrating on command. She placed her palm against the wall, and the wood thrummed faintly, not from within but from outside, as though something was resonating through the ground. The next morning she installed a vibration analyzer, a device she had borrowed from her employer during her early field work. It was designed to measure subtle ground movements for soil studies, but she reasoned it would reveal whether the noise Lucas complained of truly originated in her barn. Over the course of several nights, she logged the data, only to discover something stranger than she expected. The analyzer registered strong spikes at irregular intervals, always between midnight and 3 a.m., yet her barn remained inert. What startled her further was a detail she noticed only after overlaying the data with her own handwritten log of neighborhood observations. Each time the spikes occurred, the lights in Lucas's house flickered momentarily, a brief stutter visible through the thick curtains when the street was otherwise still. It was a pattern, consistent enough to suggest coordination, as though the disturbances pinned to her barn were in fact echoing from his own property. Cassandra debated whether to confront him directly, but a quiet voice inside warned against it. He had already chosen the path of litigation, bypassing the courtesy of conversation. If she approached him now, it would only be twisted into evidence of intimidation. Instead, she shared the results with Marissa, who frowned but reminded her that while the findings were compelling, they would not carry the same weight in court as the official-looking charts Lucas had presented. "What you need," Marissa said, "is something undeniable, something that cannot be dismissed as coincidence or misinterpretation. Until then, we're just shadowboxing with his version of reality." The sense of being shadowboxed by an invisible opponent deepened when Cassandra began noticing other small intrusions into her life. Twice she found her mailbox left ajar with nothing inside, though she was certain she had heard the postal truck pass earlier in the day. Once she discovered the latch on the barn door unfastened, though she had developed the habit of double-checking it each night. None of these events could be proven as tampering, and each could have been explained as absent-mindedness on her part. But, taken together, they painted the picture of someone quietly eroding her sense of security. Lucas himself remained outwardly passive, never acknowledging her when she passed his house, his curtains drawn so tightly that they looked less like fabric and more like walls of shadow. Cassandra tried to rally the support of her other neighbors, gently asking whether they had heard anything unusual at night. Most responded with polite shrugs, saying they kept their windows closed or slept through whatever might have been happening. A few, however, were more cautious in their replies, lowering their voices as if the street itself could overhear. One middle-aged woman with tired eyes admitted that she sometimes heard faint rhythms late at night, not the whir of machinery, but something she described as music without melody, a pulsing beat carried on the air. She had assumed it was teenagers playing around in the woods. When Cassandra asked if the sound seemed to come from her barn, the woman hesitated, then shook her head. "Not from you," she said finally, "from the other direction." From him, she tilted her chin toward Lucas's curtained house before retreating quickly inside, as though she regretted speaking at all. That comment lodged itself in Cassandra's mind, replaying over the following days as she attempted to focus on her work. If Lucas was the source of the noise, why would he construct an elaborate case to blame her? What did he gain by pushing her into the role of defendant? The answer seemed to lie not in the surface-level complaint about sound, but in something deeper, a hidden layer of activity that required her silence or removal. The barn was merely convenient as a scapegoat, its visible equipment an easy target for suspicion. The real question was what Lucas was hiding behind his closed curtains and flickering lights. Her suspicion reached a new pitch when she returned home one evening to find a plain white envelope tucked into the crack of her front door. Inside was not a threat in the usual sense, but a single sheet of paper with a line of text printed neatly in black ink. "Not everything that vibrates comes from where you think." There was no signature, no address, nothing to suggest who had delivered it, only the faint chemical smell of toner. Cassandra sat at her kitchen table staring at the words until the letters blurred, wondering whether the note was meant as a warning, a taunt, or both. What it confirmed, however, was that someone was watching her closely enough to know the questions she was asking and the data she was collecting. By the end of the week, the line between paranoia and prudence had grown so thin that Cassandra no longer trusted her own instincts. She began locking every window, triple-checking the barn, and recording the hum of her equipment even when it was silent, just to have proof of the absence of noise. Yet, even with all her precautions, the deeper dread was not the sound itself, but the awareness that Lucas had succeeded in altering the fabric of her daily life. She was no longer a researcher pursuing her quiet project, but a defendant navigating a story that had been written for her. A story that placed her at the center of blame while obscuring whatever shadows thrived in his own basement. Cassandra had grown used to being cautious, to second-guessing every noise, every flicker of light, every small irregularity that suggested someone else was tugging at the strings of her life. But nothing prepared her for the way her suspicion would. Finally break through the fog and reveal something undeniably solid. It began, almost accidentally, with a practical decision. Her attorney Marissa suggested that they look deeper into utility records, not only Cassandra's but also those belonging to the properties on her street. The reasoning was simple and entirely legitimate. If Lucas claimed her barn was creating consistent disturbances, it should show in her energy consumption. And, likewise, if those disturbances were fabricated, the source might leave its own footprint. Somewhere else. Cassandra hesitated at the legality, but Marissa assured her that public record requests for electrical usage were permitted under county transparency statutes, though the reports would only provide bulk numbers rather than precise details. When the documents arrived, Cassandra spread them across her kitchen table, the columns of kilowatt hours looking as anonymous as grocery receipts. Her own numbers matched her expectations, steady, modest, occasionally spiking during long experimental runs, but never erratic. Lucas's records, however, told a different story. His small, single-resident home was consuming power at a level that rivaled a mid-sized commercial property, with sudden nighttime surges that aligned almost exactly with the hours his charts had accused Cassandra of producing noise. The discrepancy was startling not only in scale, but in brazenness. If anyone from the utility company had looked closely, they would have questioned how a man living alone could possibly justify such use. Yet the records were there, quietly listing months of excessive consumption without scrutiny. Cassandra felt a mixture of triumph and dread. The evidence supported her suspicion, but it also confirmed that Lucas was hiding something far larger than petty malice. She imagined the possibilities. An illegal workshop, perhaps, or a hoarded collection of high-powered equipment. The idea that it might be connected to music, to sound systems, crept in only after she remembered her neighbor's hushed remark about hearing rhythm through the night. Once she thought of it, she could not let it go. The vibration analyzer's spikes, the flickering lights, the faint pulses on the air that were not her fans but something deeper, all of it began to shape itself into the image of a concealed space where silence was deliberately drowned out by engineered sound. The question of how he managed to mask it became clearer when she visited the county offices to review old property maps. She found that his house, built decades earlier, still had architectural drawings on file that included a basement larger than the footprint suggested. At some point in the past, it had been expanded unofficially. The updated plans never filed. The documents revealed stairwells, additional rooms, ventilation routes, and enough space for activities that could never be guessed from the plain box visible from the street. The realization struck her with the force of inevitability. Lucas had created a hidden world beneath his house, and he was projecting its noise outward, disguising its origins by aligning his accusations with her visible barn. Cassandra knew this was no longer something she could confront with evidence alone. She needed allies, not only Marissa but also officials who would be forced to act if the truth were placed before them. She scheduled another meeting with her attorney, laying out the power records, the property maps, and her own logs. Marissa, though careful not to overreact, could not hide the sharp glint in her eyes as she studied the alignment of data. "If this is accurate," she said slowly, "then your neighbor is not just lying about the noise. He's operating something substantial and illegal. The fact that he went on the offensive first, filing suit against you, suggests he was afraid of being discovered." Cassandra asked whether they should present the findings directly to the judge, but Marissa advised caution. The court would dismiss anything not properly verified, and Lucas's lawyer would seize the chance to label Cassandra paranoid. Instead, Marissa proposed an official request for inspection, framed not as an accusation, but as a means of disproving Lucas's claims. While the legal gears turned, Cassandra continued her quiet surveillance, documenting every irregularity. One night, unable to sleep, she walked the perimeter of her property and found herself standing at the back fence line, staring at the dark shape of Lucas's house. The curtains were drawn, but through the faintest gap she saw a flicker not of household lamplight but of colored strobe, the kind that belonged in nightclubs. The pulse lasted only seconds before vanishing, yet it confirmed everything the paperwork had suggested. She felt both vindicated and profoundly unsettled. She was living next to a man who had buried an entire different life beneath his floor, and for reasons she could not yet imagine, he had decided to shield it by destroying hers. The next hearing provided an unexpected twist. Lucas's lawyer arrived with a new set of documents claiming to have additional proof of Cassandra's negligence. Yet, when the judge reviewed them, he noted again that the times listed coincided with hours when Cassandra could not have been operating her equipment, including one night when she had an airline ticket confirming she was out of the state. The judge's expression tightened, and though he did not accuse Lucas of falsification, he made it clear that the evidence was questionable. Lucas sat still, his hands folded, his eyes fixed on a point just above Cassandra's head, as though he could not or would not acknowledge her presence. For Cassandra, the moment marked a shift. The tide was no longer purely against her. Suspicion was now shared, though still muted, within the walls of the court. After the session, Marissa pulled her aside and said quietly, "This is our opening. If we push for verification, we can compel an inspection." He won't expect that Cassandra nodded, but a knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. It was one thing to suspect, another to know, and she feared what they might find when the hidden doors were forced open. That evening, when she returned home, a package waited at her door. No sender, no markings, just a plain cardboard box sealed with tape. Inside, she found a pair of industrial-grade earplugs and a folded piece of paper that read, "If you can't hear it, you can't prove it." Her hands trembled as she held the objects, realizing that whoever had delivered them had crossed from indirect manipulation into direct contact. It was no longer about noise or legal maneuvers. It was about silencing her, literally and metaphorically, before she uncovered too much. And yet, instead of paralyzing her, the gesture hardened her resolve. She placed the earplugs on her desk as a reminder that the truth was not hidden in silence, but in the sounds Lucas tried so desperately to disguise. The barn was no longer the issue. It had never been. The true midpoint of her ordeal was the realization that she was standing at the edge of someone else's secret empire, one built in darkness, pulsing with sound, waiting to be dragged into the light. By the time the court hinted at the possibility of an inspection, Cassandra's life had shifted from quiet research and ordered notes into a constant battle against invisible pressures, each day measured not by progress on her project, but by how successfully she could maintain composure against the creeping sense of invasion. The anonymous package with its earplugs and mocking note had not been the last of its kind. Twice more she found objects deliberately placed on her property. A scratched CD labeled only with the word "noise" left on the hood of her car, and a stack of blank forms stamped with the county seal, suggesting legal documents but containing nothing but empty lines. Both items carried the same message. Not just intimidation, but the assurance that whoever orchestrated this had access to her space, her movements, her vulnerability. Marissa urged her to document everything, but the police were reluctant to treat the incidents as crimes. "There's no direct threat," an officer explained blandly, flipping through the photographs Cassandra had provided of the objects. "It's just unusual behavior. Without evidence of trespassing or damage, we can't open an investigation. The words left her with the chilling realization that Lucas, or whoever acted on his behalf, understood exactly how to maneuver within the thin membrane of legality, pressing against her until she strained but never breaking her outright. The lawsuit remained the official battlefield, but the true war was psychological, fought in gestures designed to make her question not only her safety, but her very grasp of reality. The strangest episode occurred late one night when Cassandra returned from a meeting with Marissa and noticed that the barn, though locked as she had left it, seemed subtly altered. Inside, nothing appeared stolen, yet the arrangement of her equipment had shifted by small degrees, as if someone had walked among the machines, brushing against them, deliberately leaving a trace of presence without the obviousness of vandalism. A cable she always coiled neatly was stretched across the floor, a chair had been pulled slightly away from the table, and a thin smear of something dark marked the edge of a workbench. She touched it with her fingertip, expecting grease, but the faint, sticky residue carried the unmistakable tang of alcohol. The realization chilled her. Someone had been drinking inside her workspace, treating it not as a target, but as a territory. She doubled the locks and considered halting her experiments entirely, yet something stubborn inside refused to surrender the barn. To abandon it would be to admit that Lucas's strategy was working, that she could be erased by shadows. Instead, she expanded her monitoring, installing not just vibration analyzers but a discrete power meter on her own line, determined to capture precisely when and how her energy was being siphoned. The results were damning. During the hours she slept, her meter registered no unusual activity, yet the neighborhood grid still spiked, proving the noise attributed to her could not possibly originate from her property. Lucas, however, escalated his accusations with a parallel rhythm. He filed complaints not only in court but also with local zoning authorities, claiming her barn violated safety ordinances. Inspectors arrived unannounced one afternoon, clipboards in hand, walking the perimeter of her property with the officious air of men performing a duty without conviction. Cassandra presented every permit, every inspection report from the initial renovation, yet the disruption was effective. Her project timeline fractured, her confidence worn thin by the knowledge that at any moment another authority figure could appear at Lucas's behest, demanding proof, demanding compliance, demanding her submission to a story she had not written. The retaliation grew bolder. One evening she returned home to find that someone had hurled small stones at her windows, not enough to break them but enough to rattle the glass and leave faint crescents of impact. On her porch lay one of the stones wrapped in a slip of paper that read, in block letters, "Echoes stay where they belong." It was not an explicit threat, but the meaning was clear. Stop drawing attention. Stop pursuing the truth. The silence of the street in that moment was unbearable, every dark window concealing either complicity or indifference, and Cassandra felt the crushing loneliness of realizing that though she was surrounded by neighbors, she stood entirely alone in the fight. Yet within the growing fear lay a harder edge of resolve. The more Lucas pushed, the more transparent his motives became. If he had nothing to hide, he would not go to such lengths to destabilize her. Marissa reminded her that escalation often preceded exposure, that those most desperate to conceal were also those most reckless in their attempts to distract. Cassandra clung to that thought, even as she lay awake listening for footsteps that never came, replaying in her mind the image of colored light leaking through Lucas's curtains and the pounding rhythm that sometimes hummed faintly beneath the soil. The turning point of this escalation came when a technician from the power company, responding to what he believed was a routine service request, mistakenly arrived at Cassandra's door. He explained that he had been sent to investigate irregular consumption patterns at the address and asked to see her meter. Cassandra showed him her data logs, and within minutes he realized the service ticket had been misdirected. The anomaly belonged to Lucas's line, not hers. Before leaving, he hesitated, lowering his voice, and said, "Whoever's in that house is running something big, bigger than most businesses I service. and they don't want anyone asking questions." The words confirmed everything Cassandra feared and strengthened her determination to press forward, but they also deepened the danger. Lucas was no longer merely her neighbor. He was the architect of a system that pulsed beneath the surface of their quiet street, one that demanded secrecy at any cost. By dragging her into court, by harassing her with whispers and shadows, he had declared that she was the one variable he could not control, and if she refused to vanish, the next move would not be subtle. She sensed it in the tightening coil of his silence, in the way the curtains never shifted, but the lights sometimes flickered, in the sense that every night carried her closer to the moment when the hidden world beneath his basement would no longer stay contained. The decision to push for an inspection was not made lightly, but once Marissa filed the motion and the court approved it, the tension on the street shifted in ways Cassandra could almost feel in the air. Lucas no longer bothered with the appearance of civility. He ceased acknowledging the court altogether, delegating every word to his lawyer, and outside the hearings he vanished entirely, his house becoming more of a sealed box than ever before. The night before the inspection, Cassandra barely slept, pacing her living room and listening for the phantom vibrations she had grown accustomed to, wondering what would happen when officials finally set foot inside the fortress he had built around his life. By morning, the street was lined with unmarked police vehicles, their presence subdued but unmistakable. Officers moved quietly across the lawn, carrying clipboards and toolkits, their faces neutral, betraying neither expectation nor suspicion. From her porch, Cassandra watched as they knocked once, twice, then forced entry when no answer came. The door splintered with a sound that reverberated down the block, and for a long moment there was silence as the officers disappeared inside. Then came the muffled exchange of voices, footsteps echoing down a stairwell, the faint scrape of furniture being shifted. Cassandra felt her breath catch as one of the officers re-emerged, speaking urgently into his radio, and within minutes more, vehicles arrived. Lights flashing through their sirens remained muted out of deference to the neighborhood. The truth, once locked beneath Lucas's floor, was being pulled into the open. When they finally escorted her to witness the results, Cassandra stepped carefully down the narrow staircase into a space that bore no resemblance to the quiet, shuttered house above. The basement had been gutted and rebuilt into a labyrinth of rooms lined with soundproofing foam, cables snaking across the floor to an array of speakers stacked in towers, mixing boards glowing with colored lights, and refrigeration units stocked with alcohol in quantities that suggested distribution rather than personal use. Against one wall, a row of folding chairs and battered couches bore the unmistakable stains of long nights and careless bodies. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and stale beer, as though the walls themselves exhaled the memory of music that had been silenced only hours before. What stunned Cassandra most was not the equipment, but the sheer audacity of its concealment. The space was not an amateur project, but a fully operational nightclub buried beneath a suburban home, complete with ventilation rerouted through old ducts, lighting rigs disguised behind false walls, and even a rudimentary stage. It was not difficult to imagine the basement filled with bodies pressed close, the floor vibrating with bass, the very vibrations that had been redirected toward her barn in the form of falsified evidence. Every accusation Lucas had hurled at her had been a reflection of his own secret, every chart a map of his activity disguised as hers. An officer turned to her, perhaps sensing the disbelief etched across her face, and said quietly, "It's bigger than we thought." He wasn't just hiding parties. He was running a business, maybe more. Another added, almost with a note of grim irony, "You realize he tried to bury you with the very noise he was making himself. He wanted you silenced before anyone thought to look under his floor." Cassandra nodded mutely, her throat too tight for words, as she stared at the lights still blinking faintly on the mixing board, like the last gasps of a heart refusing to die. When Lucas was finally brought out, handcuffed and flanked by officers, his expression remained unreadable. The same flat detachment he had worn in court, But when his eyes met Cassandra's across the lawn, there was no mistaking the contempt in them. For a moment she felt the same unease that had haunted her for weeks, the sense of being targeted not by circumstance but by intent. Yet this time the balance had shifted. He was no longer the accuser. He was the accused, dragged into daylight with the weight of proof heavy enough to crush even his fabrications. As the vehicles pulled away and the street returned to its unnatural quiet, Cassandra stood on her porch, her body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. The barn loomed behind her, silent as it had always been, while across the way Lucas's house stood gutted, its secrets exposed. The climax of her ordeal was not the noise itself, but the revelation that what had threatened to erase her had always been the echo of someone else's hidden life, and that by refusing to surrender to silence, she had forced the truth to be heard. In the weeks that followed the raid, the neighborhood seemed to exhale in cautious relief, though the silence that returned was not the same as before. The nights were truly still now. No phantom vibrations coursing through the soil, no flicker of colored light hidden behind curtains, no invented echoes to accuse Cassandra's barn of crimes it had never committed. Lucas's house remained shuttered, its basement sealed with heavy locks and county tape, a monument to the deception that had haunted the street. Neighbors who once offered little more than polite nods now approached her with tentative apologies, admitting they had suspected something but never dared to speak. Their words carried a mixture of shame and gratitude, as though her ordeal had pulled a shadow from their own lives as well. For Cassandra, the relief was tangible but not simple. She returned to her work slowly, reacquainting herself with the comfort of ordered data and the steady hum of equipment, yet the barn no longer felt like just a laboratory. It had become a symbol of resilience, a place where she had withstood weeks of gaslighting, intimidation, and the slow erosion of certainty. Standing at her workbench one evening, she realized that what she had reclaimed was not only her project but her right to exist without apology in a community that had nearly turned its back on her. The court dismissed the lawsuit formally, noting that the evidence against her was not only flawed but deliberately falsified. The language was dry, stripped of drama, yet for Cassandra it carried the weight of vindication. She did not celebrate loudly, did not throw open her doors to neighbors or bask in the muted coverage that briefly appeared in local news. Instead, she marked the moment quietly, planting a row of saplings along the edge of her property, a living boundary between her life and the fractured shadows of the house 2 lots away. And yet, even in her peace, she could not fully shake the knowledge that silence itself was fragile. Sometimes, when she stood on her porch at dusk, she found herself listening too intently, waiting for a pulse that never came, half expecting the ground to tremble with hidden rhythms. The absence of sound was its own reminder, a space where memory lingered. But she did not fear it now. The barn stood firm, the saplings rooted themselves in the soil, and Cassandra understood that survival was not about erasing the echoes of the past, but about recognizing them for what they were, and refusing to let them dictate the story of her future